My name is Margaret. I'm 63 years old. And last week, my 6-year-old granddaughter asked if I was homeless. We were standing in the grocery store parking lot, right between the shopping carts and a row of spotless SUVs. When she reached out to hug me, and her father pulled her back, Nathan, my son, smoothed his designer shirt like my presence might wrinkle it. He glanced around, like someone might be watching. People might get the wrong idea, he whispered, as if love from a grandmother could be misinterpreted. I smiled, but only because I didn't know what else to do. I watched as little Tommy, my 4-year-old grandson, stared up at me, confused. Emma's arms fell to her sides. Nathan told them not to hug Grandma in public anymore. He said I looked off, messy, like someone they shouldn't be seen with. He didn't say it outright, but I've lived long enough to hear the words behind the silence. They think I've lost it, that ever since Donald passed away, I've gone into some kind of decline, that I've given up on myself. But what they don't understand, what they never took the time to ask, is that I didn't lose myself. I finally found her. It didn't happen overnight. 18 months ago, I buried my husband in a quiet, expensive cemetery outside the city. I wore a black Chanel suit. My hair was done. My nails perfect. My pearls shined. And I remember standing there, feeling not just the weight of losing Donald, but something deeper. I was mourning a version of myself that had been long gone. That day, I realized I had spent decades living a life defined by other people's expectations. The picture-perfect wife, the graceful hostess, the woman with good taste and expensive shoes. I had become a silhouette more than a person. So I made a choice that day, one that still makes my family uncomfortable. I stopped pretending. I gave away the designer clothes. I let my silver hair grow out. Stopped coloring it every 6 weeks. I canceled the car service and took the bus. I bought jeans from a thrift store and sneakers that didn't hurt my feet. I started walking more, listening more, noticing things I had forgotten to see. To the world, I looked like someone who had slipped through the cracks. But I wasn't broken. I was finally free. What Nathan didn't know, standing there wiping the door handle I had touched, was that while he'd been climbing his corporate ladder and looking down on me, I'd been building something far more important. I'd been watching, listening, learning, and what I discovered was going to change everything for both of us. It was a clear spring morning when we buried Donald. The sky was too blue, the grass too green, the wind too gentle. Everything felt wrong, like the world hadn't received the news that someone important was missing. I remember holding on to the edge of his casket as they lowered it, and thinking, what now? For 40 years, I had been Donald's wife. I supported him, stood beside him, hosted dinners, sat quietly through board meetings, smiled for photographs. I wore the right clothes, said the right things. I made our life look perfect. And maybe it was. But I lost something in that performance. I lost the part of me that used to ask why instead of how much. After the funeral, people came up to me and said all the expected things. You'll be okay. Time heals. He was lucky to have you. They meant well. But none of them really knew me. Not even my own son. Especially not Nathan. He expected me to carry on just as before. Hair appointments, charity events, manicures every Tuesday. But something inside me had shifted. I didn't want any of it anymore. I didn't want to live in a house full of silence and fine china. I didn't want to smile politely at women who pitied me. I didn't want to be invisible in heels and lipstick. So I did something that felt radical. I stopped. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment across town. I bought a used bike. I made my own coffee, instead of going to that overpriced place where no one remembers your name. I started volunteering at a community kitchen just to be around people who didn't care what car I used to drive. For the first time in years, I could breathe. Nathan thought I was grieving. He told me I should see someone, that I wasn't acting like myself. And he was right. I wasn't. I was acting like who I had been before the world told me to fit into a box. Before I learned to smile through disappointment and nod through condescension. It wasn't that I didn't love Donald. I did. But our life had been curated. Manicured. Constructed like one of those magazines you flip through in a waiting room. There were real moments. Of course. But they were surrounded by appearances. When he died, I realized I could finally stop performing. My new life was simpler. Slower. I had fewer people around me. But more real conversations. I shopped with coupons. And no one cared what my last name was. I walked into places without being recognized. And I found that oddly comforting. And in the quiet, I started to notice things. Details. Habits. Conversations that people had when they thought no one was listening. I started hearing stories that didn't add up. Especially stories about my son. But I'll get to that. Because this story doesn't start with betrayal. It starts with freedom. It starts with the moment I realized I didn't want to look rich. I wanted to be real. And once you stop caring about appearances, you start seeing everything more clearly. There's something strange that happens when people stop noticing you. They stop filtering what they say. You become part of the background. Like an old chair or a faded painting. That's when they start talking freely. Even recklessly. Right in front of you. It started in a coffee shop near the apartment I'd moved into. Nothing fancy. Just strong drip coffee and cracked vinyl booths. The kind of place where people come in suits during the day and hoodies at night. I'd sit by the window with my notebook, pretending to write lists or crossword puzzles. While I listened. At first, it was harmless. Small talk. Gossip. Then I heard a man with a shiny watch talk about moving retirement money into something he called a proprietary fund. Another man, younger, corrected him. He said it wasn't a fund. Really. More like a cash float model that could be tailored per client. It sounded like nonsense. Polished nonsense. Then I heard that same phrase again. A week later, in line at the bank. And again at a city planning meeting I sat in on, just to kill time. Every time, it was someone different. Every time, they were talking about investments that guaranteed returns. That's what caught my ear. That word? Guaranteed. By then I'd been living this invisible life for months. I had become fluent in quiet spaces. I'd learned how to observe. How to stay still. How to collect threads of stories without ever pulling them too tightly. And slowly, I began to pull those threads together. The first time I heard Nathan's name come up, I thought I was mistaken. It was at the same coffee shop. A group of women were talking about financial advisors. One of them said her mother's consultant had a great track record. She even mentioned the name of the firm. My son's firm. I sat there frozen for a second. Not because he was successful, I'd always known that, but because I knew that woman's mother. Her name was Eleanor Grant. She'd been at my wedding. She used to bake lemon bars for my family when we first moved into our old neighborhood. I waited until the women left. Then I wrote down everything I remembered from their conversation. I started researching. Quietly. Carefully. I wasn't ready to confront Nathan. I wasn't sure I ever would be. But I needed to know. It didn't take long. Eleanor's statements didn't match up. Her account showed growth that wasn't reflected in any public market trends. The fund names were vague. The returns were suspiciously consistent. I knew just enough about finance thanks to Donald to know when something felt off. So I visited Eleanor. I told her I was worried. At first, she was defensive. Then she showed me the paperwork. Glossy printouts. Flawless numbers. She said Nathan had been helping her since her husband died. That she trusted him like family. That was the part that broke me. Because he was family? My family. My son. Eleanor mentioned she hadn't been able to afford her prescriptions lately. She said she tried to take out some of her money, but had trouble reaching anyone. That was all I needed to hear. I asked if she would let me look deeper. She said yes. I started documenting everything. I made copies. I asked questions. I followed the money. And with every page, I stopped being invisible not to the world, but to myself. I was no longer just a woman grieving her husband. I was a mother, a witness, a quiet storm building strength. And soon, I'd be ready to strike. There's a certain irony in watching your own child walk confidently into a building he thinks he owns. Well, not legally, but in spirit. Nathan always liked to say his office space was a steal, that the rent was below market, that the landlord was some faceless corporation too lazy to negotiate. I never said a word. The building was mine. I had purchased it 18 years ago under a shell company Donald helped me set up. We had a quiet understanding. He handled the flashy ventures. I handled the slow, steady properties that built real wealth. It was our unspoken balance. Our version of equality. Nathan never asked who owned the place. Never questioned the leasing terms. Never imagined that the woman who now wore faded jeans and carried a canvas tote bag had been signing off on his rent checks for 5 years. I kept it that way on purpose. He thought I had stepped away from the world, that I had become irrelevant, that I didn't understand his success or the rules he played by. But the truth was, I understood it better than he did. I'd built the rules. I'd just chosen to play a different game. The more I learned about what he'd done, the more the building became symbolic. He'd built his empire on a lie inside a building, owned by the one person he thought was beneath him. I wasn't just watching him from a distance. I was surrounding him, brick by brick. And he never saw it coming. Once I knew what Nathan had done, he stopped hesitating. I called Eleanor. I called a lawyer I trusted. I started compiling everything. Paper trails, emails, voicemails. I filed every receipt, every suspicious document, every discrepancy. That's when someone else stepped in. His name was Alan, but he introduced himself as Mr. Gray, said he'd worked with Donald years ago, managing some of the quieter assets. I didn't recognize him, but he seemed to know everything about our old trusts, our shell companies, the way we'd structured things to stay under the radar. He wasn't surprised by what Nathan had done. That, more than anything, unsettled me. Alan offered to help, said he'd been keeping an eye on things ever since Donald passed, that my husband had left instructions in case Nathan ever crossed a line. I didn't ask how he knew. I didn't care. I needed the support. Together, we rebuilt the timeline. We tracked Eleanor's money. We found others like her clients. Nathan had convinced to invest in vehicles that didn't exist. We found documents he'd doctored, call logs he tried to erase. He hadn't been careful. He'd just been arrogant. And the final piece, the one that made everything click, was a contract. A leasing document for Nathan's office. Signed under one of my older aliases. That paper meant I didn't just have evidence. I had leverage. We filed the preliminary report with Detective Monroe, a contact Alan trusted. Quietly, without tipping Nathan off. We didn't want a confrontation. Not yet. I wanted him to walk into that office one last time, thinking the world still worked the way he wanted it to. I wanted him to smile in his suit, greet his elderly clients, pour them coffee from his fancy machine, and feel invincible, because that would make the moment when it all collapsed unforgettable. I arrived at Nathan's office 10 minutes before his big client meeting. I didn't knock. I didn't call ahead. I walked through the glass doors like I belonged there. Because I did. I'd signed the lease. I paid the taxes. I owned the building. It was time he remembered that. The receptionist gave me a once-over. In the same look, people always give women who look out of place. She smiled too tightly and asked if I was lost. I told her I was here to see my son. She asked if I had an appointment. I told her I didn't need one. When she hesitated, I said something that made her flinch. I said, "I'm his mother." She blinked. The smile cracked. She reached for the phone. But I was already walking. Through the glass walls, I saw him, Nathan, standing at the head of a long table, gesturing to a group of older couples seated in leather chairs. A chart lit up behind him. He was mid-pitch. I paused at the door. He noticed me. His face stiffened. But only for a second. He smiled that careful, professional smile. "Mom, what a surprise." He turned to his audience. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet my mother." I stepped into the room. My shoes echoed softly against the polished floor. The clients looked at me, confused. Some were kind. Some looked embarrassed for him. He motioned for someone to bring an extra chair, but I was already pulling one out. "Please, don't let me interrupt. I'd love to hear more about these guaranteed returns you're offering." He froze. The smile faltered. "Mom, this really isn't." I opened my bag, pulled out a folder, slid the first page across the table. It was a bank statement. Eleanor's name printed in the top corner. "This is one of the portfolios you manage, isn't it?" The room was silent. Nathan glanced at the document, then back at me. His voice lowered. "We can talk about this later. I think now works just fine." I laid out more papers. Account discrepancies. Fabricated statements. Emails. Names of clients he'd targeted. Then I spoke directly to the room. Eleanor Grant trusted my son with everything she had. He promised her growth. He promised safety. But when she needed to withdraw money for her medication, she learned her account had been empty for months. Someone gasped. One of the men narrowed his eyes. Nathan stood up. His voice sharp. "You don't know what you're talking about. You're embarrassing yourself? And me." I stood too. Calm. Unshaken. "Am I, or are you just angry that someone finally called you out?" I looked at the clients. "This isn't just a mistake. It's a pattern. He's been targeting seniors with complex financial jargon and fake investment models. And he's been doing it from inside a building he never bothered to ask who owned." At that moment, the door opened. Detective Monroe stepped in, followed by 2 officers. Behind them was Alan Mr. Gray and another man I didn't recognize at first. He looked just like Donald. A little older. A little taller. But the same eyes. "Hello. Margaret," the man said. I stared. I couldn't speak. He stepped forward gently. "I'm Andrew, Donald's brother." The room spun. Donald never mentioned a brother. He had his reasons. We were estranged for a long time. I turned to Nathan. His face had drained of color. Detective Monroe spoke. "Mr. Harrison, we have a warrant for your arrest." The clients recoiled as officers stepped forward. Nathan sputtered something about misunderstandings. "Legal teams. Setups." I said nothing. Because justice didn't need my voice anymore. It had found its own. Later that afternoon, I sat in a quiet office on the top floor. Andrew poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to me. His eyes were soft, but tired, like someone carrying decades of regret. He said Donald had reached out to him months before he died. That they'd made peace. That Donald had confessed everything, the early deals, the shady beginnings, the things he kept from me because he was ashamed. I listened in silence. Donald had started out reckless, ambitious. He followed Andrew into business because he trusted him. But when Andrew cut corners, Donald backed away. He told his brother to clean up or walk away. Andrew walked. And they didn't speak again for almost 40 years. Donald spent the rest of his life trying to undo the damage. He invested in clean projects. Built a reputation, kept me in the light. While he dealt with his guilt in the dark, he never told me. He thought protecting me meant keeping secrets. Before he died, he left instructions with Andrew. To protect me, to step in if Nathan ever crossed the line. He'd seen the signs. He knew our son was heading down the same path. He just didn't have time to stop it himself. Andrew showed me the plans. A foundation? A vision Donald had sketched out with Eleanor before she passed. It would offer financial protection, education, and legal support for the elderly. Everything Eleanor had needed? Too late. He said Donald wanted me to decide what to do with the money. With the properties? With the legacy? I looked at the photos on Andrew's desk. Donald. Smiling. Donald. Younger than I remembered. Us on our wedding day. Me. Before I became invisible, I knew what I had to do. I would turn guilt into grace. I would turn what we built into something that finally made sense. I decided then and there to use every resource at my disposal to build something meaningful. The Eleanor Grant Foundation would be more than a name on a plaque. It would be a force for change, a place where elderly people could find help before they became victims. The foundation's mission was clear: protect the vulnerable, educate families, investigate fraud, and provide legal assistance. We worked quickly, turning paperwork into programs, funds into hope. The community rallied. Volunteers signed up. Attorneys offered pro bono services. Survivors shared their stories. Nathan's assets, the cars, the houses, the stocks bought with stolen money were being liquidated and returned to those he'd harmed. It wasn't about revenge. It was about restitution and prevention. Eleanor's spirit seemed to guide us all, reminding me why justice mattered more than anger. I still lived modestly. The same one-bedroom apartment. The same thrift store sweaters. But I carried myself differently now. There was power in choosing authenticity over appearances. There was pride in turning pain into purpose. This was my redemption. Our redemption. 6 months later, I found myself outside Emma and Tommy's school. My heart pounded with the weight of what I was about to face. Their mother, Thea, had agreed to meet me here, a neutral ground away from reporters and neighbors. Watching them play, I felt a mix of hope and heartbreak. They were too young to understand the full story. To know their father was in prison for crimes that shattered lives, they just knew Daddy had work problems. That wasn't enough. When Emma ran into my arms, her joy wiped away some of the ache. Tommy's hesitant hand found mine. And suddenly, the world made sense again. They asked questions simple, honest questions. Is Daddy in jail? Why do you live like this? Am I really homeless? I knelt to their level and spoke as gently and truthfully as I could. I told them that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes. That Daddy made some very bad choices. And that I helped make sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. Their innocence was humbling. Emma's firm declaration that stealing is wrong, even if it's your daddy's choice, reminded me how clear justice can be through a child's eyes. Thea and I stood together. No longer adversaries, but allies, in the hard work of healing. Watching those kids reminded me what this fight was really about, not just justice, but love. And in that moment, I knew we would be okay. 6 months after everything changed, I stood outside the community center with Emma and Tommy on either side of me. The sun was warm, the air buzzing with quiet excitement. Today was the inaugural gala for the Eleanor Grant Foundation. A cause born from pain, but fueled by hope. As we walked through the doors, I saw the crowd gathered inside survivors of financial abuse. Their families, lawyers, volunteers, and advocates. Faces filled with gratitude and determination. I spotted Andrew talking quietly with Detective Monroe and James Taylor, Eleanor's grandson. Nearly $2 million had been recovered for victims. Offices had opened in 3 states. Nathan had been sentenced to 15 years. His lawyer tried to blame me. But the evidence was irrefutable. Justice had prevailed. Emma whispered, "Are you nervous?" "Grandma," I smiled and admitted I was just a little. Tommy, serious beyond his years, said, "You look beautiful. And you're doing important work." That simple affirmation settled something inside me. This journey from a woman invisible in faded jeans to a leader standing tall had come full circle. I wasn't just Margaret anymore. I was a force for change. A beacon for those who had been silenced. I looked out at the room filled with hope, healing, and the promise of a better future. And I knew, without a doubt, I had finally become who I was meant to be. I had walked in alone, but now, I walk with purpose,